Namaste, motherfuckers.
Welcome to Namaste, Motherfuckers, the only podcast where the worlds of comedy, self-help and business collide. I'm your host, Cally Beaton, and today's episode is called From Right On to Right Wing. This is the story of how a working class kid born into a Labour household in South London ended up deserting the left and voting Tory. So let's talk about class for a moment. To quote Spike Milligan, money can't buy you friends, but you do get a better class of enemy. Britain has always been a society deeply divided by class. Here's a thing you may not know, or you may know it. The listeners of Namaste Motherfuckers are nothing if not erudite, but here goes anyway. The term "you guys" originated as a way of describing low-class rogues and villains. It came from the traditional burning of guys on Guy Fawkes Night. The RSPB began in 1889 as a protest organised by the middle-class women of Didsbury against the trade in feathers for fashionable hats. The most middle-class thing that happened to me this week was opening the larder to find a mouse tucking into my chia seeds, and I wish any part of that sentence wasn't actually true. But the reality is that social mobility is in decline in Britain, according to a recent poll by the Social Mobility Commission. Although over 60% of people felt they had received a better school education than their parents, nearly half said they had a worse standard of living. Most people of all ages agreed that there were fewer opportunities for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to go to a top university or to own their own home.
Get me on a better microphone.
Oh, that's nicer.
There you go.
That's mellifluous, as I believe they say, of honey-toned vocals.
I've been speaking a lot today.
That's my guest today, comedian, writer and political commentator Geoff Norcott. The survey results also showed that over 40% of people agreed that where a person ends up in society is largely determined by their background. Geoff is the exception to that rule. He is now a conservative voting, married man living in rural Cambridgeshire, a self-described right-wing centrist dad.
I had two bits today. I had Julia Hartley-Brewer's show this morning, then Politics Live.
Look at you throwing those things about like it's not even a thing. How is it?
With Julia's politics, she'd probably have me on every single day, isn't it?
That's true. Spoiler alert. You'll no doubt have seen Geoff on the MASH Report, Mock the Week, Would I Lie to You, 8 out of 10 Cats, or heard him on the News Quiz. He fronted his own BBC Two documentary, How the Middle Class Ruined Britain, and his appearances as a social commentator include Question Time, Loose Ends and the Today programme. He's a satirical commentator in various national newspapers, and as a comedy writer he is in high demand. Geoff and I talked about the right, the left, class, Russ Abbott, grief, masculinity, therapy, disability, feminism, podcasting, belonging, man whispering, and pigeons. But I started by asking him about his book, Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me, which had just come out the day we spoke, 10 days ago.
It was out today, so we're recording this. Or can I timestamp when we're recording this?
Yeah.
What a wanker for saying timestamp.
Can I timestamp that? Yeah, you've really changed, Geoff. You have changed since you've gone to the right.
Since I've become a writer, actually, since I've become a lover, I guess, we've writing about my journey. What kind of nonsense is that for a kid from a council estate? I actually used the word liaise earlier as a word. I said it. Yeah. I said, if you could liaise with, and I thought, what?
That's a hard one to come back for, really. And now you've said it again. You said that you said it. So even if no one caught it the first time. Yeah.
I mean, I can see it's like all these middle class things. There are a lot of valid reasons why they take off. Brioche sounds wanky, tastes lovely. Liaise sounds wanky, very useful word.
grouse shooting? Where are you on grouse shooting? I suppose that's more upper
Well,
class than middle class, isn't it?
Oh, the thing I've realised about upper class is actually that actually applies to a really tiny amount of people, doesn't it? I
Yeah.
didn't realise how narrow that band is. So I think that's kind of country. If you know what I mean, that's a different.
Yeah.
They've managed to sort of extricate themselves from the current sort of naff perception of middle class people. We're a country people.
That's true. So do you think country people think they're posh, or they could be posh but just call it country? Do you think you could be in the country? Could you have a place in the Cotswolds and be grouse shooting with Jeremy Paxman and Cameron?
I'm now friends with Jeremy Paxman.
Are you? So you could be doing that.
Yeah. Sorry, Paxman. Did you say Paxman or Clarkson?
I said Paxman.
Oh no, not friends with Paxman. Look,
Hold on. You're friends with Jeremy Clarkson?
I say friends. He say bloke who wrote one or two jokes on his recent thing. That's how.
And I say why? Why?
No, he's great. I worked with him on a thing. We were throwing a couple of ideas about.
Was he throwing a couple of things about? Because he's known for that, isn't he?
Well, I did not see that Jeremy Clarkson. I saw he is given the way that I approach comedy. He's my grand poobah, isn't he? He's the guy that's done it before. Not, in terms of throwing things around, but just in terms of being bluntly honest and kind of damn the consequences about what he thinks. And I think that it was interesting. I mean, obviously, as he said to me, he's had to adapt what people wouldn't think that he has to adapt what he says, but he does. But he's just a very funny, clever person, He
just says, well, and is it like that we should say, for anyone who doesn't know, it kind of the book is what it says on the tin in a way, in that you grew up in a Labour household and you are now, as you described it, I think you said you're one of only about 6 right-wing comedians. So you're flying the right-wing comedy flag, but you might not have been, that might not have been anticipated had people known you as a younger man. So how do you describe yourself nowadays?
Well, politically, I think I've chilled out a bit since Brexit was delivered. The process of people trying to, from my point of view, thwart that vote, it radicalised me. And when I say radicalised, I mean I tweeted a bit more aggressively for a while than I might have otherwise have done. And I think that there was something about that 2019 general election result, which for me was, as democracy should always be, about the least shit of two options. It wasn't a rabid endorsement of Boris Johnson. I came as close to not voting at all in that election as I had for a long time. But I just sort of gone, you know what? I'm not really angry about much. What I am is interested. I think my politics are probably best described as being like a right-wing centrist dad.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really that extreme. In fact, if anything, they probably sit very close to the absolute middle of British politics. It's only the context of this industry that we work in that makes it seem in any way unusual,
And the fact that we're so divided, I guess, as a society. So even though if you look at people in power, they are actually quite centrist and have been for quite a long time. But the people trying to get in power at the moment and the stuff that's going on beyond the fringes, I guess, no one would have guessed 18 months ago that wearing a mask would be a sort of political statement and divide us.
Yeah, this is one of the things that even since I've written the book, this culture war, whatever it is, the idea that you have this composite personality, which broadly speaking comes from your Brexit vote, but then applies to how you feel about Meghan Markle, how you feel about wearing masks in Aldi. Like all of this comes from
how you feel about being in Aldi. That's another
how you
question.
feel about being. I am very comfortable in both Waitrose and an Aldi, but that's a consequence of my upbringing. Right?
Why didn't you call your book that?
If I could have got sponsorship of them, I would have. But yeah, I reject this culture war to a point. What I have is like, I just want to say exactly what I think at any given point, and So when that interview with Meghan, they do piss me off as a couple sometimes. They're a bit grating, right?
I don't like the way they put their chickens on television. Do you see that? They're always there gathering eggs, aren't they? Getting Oprah into their chicken coops. Unnecessary.
Well, it's sort of like, I did think that feeding the chickens could become a metaphor for when somebody else averts their eyes while their partner basically shits on their family. Oh, she was feeding the chickens tonight. Oh boy!
Did you see his face when she was feeding the chickens? When she did the revelation about, we actually got married 3 days before, and you could see even all his private school and army background wasn't helping him have a poker face. He was like, oh shit.
Yeah, you can only bury so many feelings. The upper classes are very good at it, but some came spilling out. But the truth was, after that interview, I felt slightly more positive towards them as a couple than I did before. And then I spoke about that on my podcast. You know, my podcast probably skews right. And people aren't always happy about that. But what I don't want to do is be owned by the idea that I have to have a pre sort of cookie cutter set of ideas that apply across all cultural issues. I think that is sort of the enemy of comedy and satire.
And is it your podcast, by the way, is called What Most People Think? And we'll, of course, put links to your podcast and your book and all the good stuff in the show notes. But I did hear talk of the fact that, because it's Patreon funded, right, your podcast, and that you were loath to take the dirty dollar from any advertisers in case it skewed the content. Was that your way of saying no one wanted to sponsor it? So I had to do
one way. No, it's what happened was when the lockdown started, I thought I do want to do this weekly. I'd always wanted to do it weekly. But equally, being a conservative, I don't really like doing anything for free. So at that point, I hadn't had any interest from advertisers, and so the Patreons kindly funded it, and it helped me invest in it, and then podcast platforms and advertisers did come in after that. But I just thought, I like this. There's this weird thing where the conservative guy with the podcast is probably one of the only people that doesn't have it plastered with advertising.
Totally misunderstood capitalism, hasn't he? You're just like,
weirdly, like the football team I support, AFC Wimbledon, are fan owned. So I'm sort of socialist in various ways. But the truth is, though, Cally, I think that I want to be absolutely free to have any guest on I want. And like I've spoken to Owen Jones, and I've spoken to Lawrence Fox, and I don't want to be answerable to anybody for that. And I think that having a group of patrons has been it's been a great thing. They're really cool people. I do also do the occasional new material gig for them, and that thing of going into London, trekking in to do 10 minutes of new stuff for a panel show, I think that I will always now do that in the same way that we're chatting now. So it's been a good thing. And look, everyone's got a price. Everyone's got a price,
haven't we?
But if I can possibly do it, it's my intention to keep it Patreon only funded.
So in terms of what you actually, it's interesting, the title of your book, Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me. That's the second of the three plugs we agreed I'd give it. Those are, so what, in terms of motivational theory, in terms of moving towards something or away from something, were you drawn towards the right, or were you kind of drawn away from the left? Which came first?
Well, I've done a lot of interviews. That's a really good question. I don't probably. Yeah, it was a mix. I mean, it was probably principally first. There were a set of personality traits that I had in very young life, which were a good sort of early kind of setup to eventually be a conservative. I was quite a judgy little kid, you know what I mean? We had owned a house on a private property for the first 8 years of my life, and then my parents got divorced, and it was then that we moved into council estate life. So I hadn't grown up in that world. It was a sort of funny status drop that occurred at a point.
Oh, that's interesting. So, because they say that it's our experiences up to the age of 7 that define us in many ways. So it's interesting that because the whole sort of, not spin of your book, because it's really you, but the backdrop of your book is, South London kid, grew up on a kind of, in part on a kind of council estate, Labour household, disabled parents, and has come out of this not as you would expect. But maybe there's it's interesting to think where so your parents were obviously the same two people when you weren't living, when you had a privately owned house. But what do you think the shift was then from those early years to suddenly being in a bit of a different social class?
Well, I mean, I voted. I went. I changed while we lived on the council estate. Then we moved to a council house in Mitcham, and Mitcham, just to give you an idea of Mitcham in South London, if people don't know it, it's the only place I know where a McDonald's shut down. Do you know anywhere else? The McDonald's in town centre shut down in 2012. So there's Mitcham, right?
Yeah.
So
that's sobering, actually. That's really made me be at a loss for words the first time since the podcast started.
It's oddly bleak, isn't it?
And
Mitcham will have always avoided gentrification, right? So I lived in a nice house in a private street. Then I lived in a rough council estate, but in Wimbledon. And everyone would go, Wimbledon must have been fine. Not in the 80s, and not if you lived near the dog track. And then I lived in a house, but in Mitcham. So my life has always sort of straddled.
You bucked the trend every which way, didn't you?
It's always straddled this precipice between two things. But I did vote. I voted Labour in 97, 2001 and stuff. And then, but there were just little elements of the sort of broadly left narrative that was starting to jar with me. Even being in teaching, you know, there was certain. I remember the prevailing winds at the time were Blair's education.
And when was it?
So that would be the early noughties.
Teaching came after advertising.
So I went into teaching in 2002, and the mood music there was all everyone's got to get a degree. And I'm thinking, do they? Do they really? Does everyone have to get? Are you telling me? And I've always felt that the kind of trades got weirdly disrespected there, and because of my background, a lot of the most sort of successful people I knew had their names on the side of a van. Your carpenters, chippies, guys that ran kind of like window fitting firms, they all did all right, and I didn't understand why those careers weren't getting any attention. And there was also then the kind of trendy teaching methods coming in at that time, and I just started to realize, I'm a bit small at this point, small C conservative.
Was that a conscious thought at the time, or did it just
it was conscious,
percolate?
No, it percolated, but I remember being aware of it and thinking, you know, started to think, oh, for God's sake, you know, the kind of thing right wingers say when left wingers start wanging on. I was in the staff room and they say things are a bit, here we go. Once you say here we go, you're already moving to the right. And I remember that one school they had kids sitting in on the panel to interview other staff, and I was like, look, I get that you're supposed to pretend that teenagers are fully rounded human beings, but they're not. Okay, they're deeply confused and superficial. And what they really need, Cally, is like structure and discipline.
They need to be tasered. No, they don't. So were you, because that wasn't that long after, we obviously lived through, I know you're a bit younger than me, but we were very much sentient beings during the kind of halcyon Blair days. Were you taken in by that? So when it was all kind of Oasis in Downing Street and all that stuff, was that, were you going for that?
Well, one, because that encompassed patriotism. Great. I've always been very patriotic. Aspiration. You know, it seemed like it was okay to want to do all right for yourself. Even though at the time I was going to a liberal arts college, Goldsmiths, which really rubbed me the
I went
wrong
to
way.
Goldsmiths as well.
Oh, did you?
What did you do there?
I did English literature there. And
I did English and drama.
I mean, English and drama, communications, TV, it was very left wing. I mean, like in the period I went there, it was straight off the back of Blur, Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin, so it's very full of itself.
Because I was there with all that lot, so you were the next wave after me.
But everyone really bought into that, but I didn't know anything about it because I was just massively naive, and I arrived there, I didn't know what sense of itself it had, and then all the corridors were full of people trying to save Cuba and save the fucking whales and just save stuff, and I was coming from a world where a lot of people were trying to save themselves, Cally. So it seemed like a, you know, possibly noble causes, but a huge privilege to have space and time in your life to want to save stuff a long way away.
It's hard for them now trying to save stuff on Zoom. There's a lot they're missing. You can't have those eye looking earnest moments. There's no point in getting banners and t-shirts done anymore. It's hard times for them. It's an
incredible hashtag though.
Yeah, that's true. But if you think about yourself as an outsider, because in lots of ways you're not afraid to speak out as an outsider on the comedy circuit, and I know I listened to your podcast with Catherine Ryan interviewing you about your book. I thought, what a genius sleight of hand to use your own podcast as an interview for your book launch and just get someone else to interview you. I thought that was very good. Well done.
There were very few other offers at that time. I mean, like, thankfully you offered me to be on this. I don't get offered to come and chat on many podcasts.
I begged you, Geoff.
But I think that people just think, and this is true of a lot of TV shows, they just think, oh, that will piss off my core audience. But I think that in a lot of cases, they don't always understand their core audience. I have loads of left-wingers on my podcast. Well,
you're also very, I owe you a few debts of thanks, because you've come along, you've seen me not that many times live, but you've always given me, you haven't done that sort of really tit thing that people sometimes do and go, oh, you know that thing you do, why don't you do that? But you're always really lovely, and you go, I had a thought, you know, do you want to hear it? And then you give me loads of really good shit that I still perform on stage to this day. So so I'm always happy to hear from you and hear what you've got to say. But if you think about being an outsider then, so what you sort of unashamedly and in fact kind of very proactively embrace what it is you think, who it is you are. I've seen a couple of your recent solo shows. You're wearing everything kind of on your sleeve. Do you think growing up always slightly not belonging, never quite being where you should have been, doing what everyone else was doing from a background everyone else had, do you think that has enabled you to be okay being treated sometimes as a bit of a kind of social pariah?
Well, yeah, I mean, I must say that in stand-up, I would love to have a narrative that I got ostracised and was kind of persona non grata. But I'd been doing a stand-up a long time before I started talking about this. So unlike other comedians that are starting to talk about this kind of politics now, at least people knew me, right? Going into it. But the sad truth is I really hate people disliking me. Like I love to be loved. And part of the reason I started talking about my politics was I realised I had a pathetic, we all have a need for approval as stand-ups, but mine was pathetic. I mean, I used to wear this shiny suit. You did. Luckily, you didn't see me.
I never
gigging
knew
around
the
this
shiny
time.
suit years.
I had to burn it. I mean, it was awful. It was awful.
Did you just
it
have
was-
one, or did you have a few?
I had a couple, and it's because I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be looked at, and all this sort of stuff. And then I just thought it come to 2013, and I was saying to my wife, "Oh, I just want to talk about other stuff." And she said, "Well, you're a Tory. That's a bit weird, isn't it?" I was like, "That is a bit weird." And then I just did 10 minutes as part of a show at the Leicester Festival that year, and it seemed to be. I felt alive again creatively. I was like, "Fuck that! That was weird." A couple of people walked out, but it was interesting. It was interesting. So, I mean, it's really strange. Like, it's like, sometimes you flirt with the thing that you're most afraid of, and mine is just being, I guess, ostracized. And yet, I do this thing, which certainly more so at the beginning, less so now. But it did put me on the brink of that in certain situations, with the general public giving me grief, I can kind of handle that. It always gives me sort of get a knot in my stomach when it's a comedian that comes for me online. I'd love to say that I don't, fuck them, I don't give a shit, but I do, sadly.
And is it, I guess, when you think about the sort of criticism leveled at you, the sort of cynical view might be, well, you are one of very few right-wing comedians. There's been a lot written about that, particularly the last year, when everyone's had a lot of time on their hands to be thinking about such things. And people who are cynical and say, well, you're getting on all the kind of shows, you're the kind of right-wing booking. But it strikes me the kind of opposite of that, having worked in telly my whole life and knowing what you get paid for things like Question Time. That is a lot of jeopardy to put yourself in for a couple of £100. So
I wish it was a couple of £100. You're getting a better rate than me on Question Time. Then. Just put it that way. Yeah. The other thing is that I was the perception I'm across. I mean, the critic from The Guardian said recently, since then he's hardly been off telly. Look, I'm lucky. I like the perception that I'm on telly a lot. I've been lucky to do some really cool shows. I think the perception that I am all across the schedules is, shall we say, me and my agent wish that was as true as people think it is. And that's not moaning. It's just a misconception.
But do you think that you are, I mean, there is a risk, isn't there, with us looking at trying to make sure diverse voices are heard and that we have a good range on all shows. Obviously, that's really important. But there's also a risk that you get the kind of go-to. I'm trying to be the go-to ginger menopausal, fairly new entrant. And sometimes it works out for me, sometimes it doesn't. But is the reality that if people are looking for a few sound bites from a right-wing comedian, they'll be like, oh, Geoff will be up for it?
Well, sometimes, they want balance on their panel, but that's no bad thing. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily look cynically at somebody doing that on the grounds of race or gender. Like, it's okay to go
jealously. I might look jealously at it and go, that's the card I can't
It's
play.
okay. But then what you've got to do, right? If you get there's no doubt there's some shows that I've been on that I probably wouldn't have done if it wasn't for the political angle, right? You just got to be honest and own that. You might get, and yourself from working in telly, you might get a couple of freebie opportunities out of good luck. But if you don't deliver and if people don't watch it, if people don't like it, people always said at the beginning about Jack Whitehall, there was a lot of bitchiness in the industry about him. But the truth is, people liked him. He's had a hugely successful team. Very few people make lots of television shows that are well watched, so that's what you've got to do. Is wherever that opportunity comes from, is to just deliver. But then the thing that I've done always is try to just say exactly what I think. And, I've been on a couple of news quizzes recently at times where I've had plenty of negatives to say about the Tory government, because, being a conservative person and supporting the Tory government aren't always exactly the same thing.
Namaste, motherfuckers.
Just going back to your background, this description of your parents. So your mum was a council estate matriarch crossed with Tony Soprano, and your dad, a maverick one-armed dad. So that sounds like quite a tough paper round, really, for a little kid to be going through. How was that?
Yeah, my mum she was just so charismatic. I did always get the sense that she was probably a frustrated Catholic Italian mother that should have had 9 sons. Right? She loved men. She was probably a chauvinist, actually. Those women that you get that just can't deal with women's bullshit. And
I do gigs to them quite often.
but she was a bit like that, you know. And she was very articulate, but she also knew politics, knew local politics, knew what she was entitled to from the council. I mean, when we were trying to get to move up from a flat to a house, the campaign of persuasion and I'll say intimidation that she put on the local council offices was quite spectacular. I mean, she was in there all the time, and when she used to walk into council offices, it was like the old saloon doors were swinging, the barman was high. We don't want no trouble in here, Jan. And she was fearsome, and that's what I suppose has always been an interesting thing with the recent incarnation of feminism. Is I think if you come from a working class background, the idea of women, particularly as shrinking violence, is an odd one, because in my family, they're definitely the voluble people, and she was very skilled with rhetorical devices and stuff. And despite having been brought up in council care herself, you know, she was she wasn't particularly resentful, but it made for a very maverick parent because she didn't have any basis to go on herself. She just made very interesting decisions in parenting.
Was she your primary carer? Who did you live with after the divorce?
So after the divorce, we moved into the council estate. My mum, at the time, it was all taken for the house, wasn't it? That was what women used to say. Remember in the 80s?
Yeah.
Taken for the house.
Yeah.
And she left him with the house. New strategy, leave him with the house, move into a council estate, which is an odd one.
She was definitely ahead of the curve, your mum, wasn't she, the whole time?
Well, I rate that as a strategy because I hate being indebted or being owned by anybody. And I guess she felt that she would have been living in his house and he was paying the rent and the mortgage and the bills and stuff like that. And she wanted to strike out on her own. And I think
I'm quite warm into your mum in this conversation. I know she's no longer with us, but the stuff. But so there were lots of kind of. I was thinking when I was thinking about talking to you today, and you're now a dad of, how old's your kid? You've got one kid, one little boy.
Yeah, he's 5.
So you're now a dad yourself. You're living a kind of nice life. You're a writer, you're a performer, comedian, you live in Cambridgeshire, I think. So you've got this kind of life that's very different.
Well, that's what when you were saying about like living in rural Cotswolds. I do live in rural Cambridgeshire now. I've gone some way.
You have gone somewhere. And it's probably, I mean, I don't really know my geography, but you're probably not far from all those people in Chipping, whatever. But Chipping, whatever. I was wondering when I was thinking about that, and I know you a bit, and we've spoken a bit about your personal life a bit. And where did you find role models then? How have you ended up being somebody who can live in a more traditional, well-functioning family when it sounds as if you came from quite some degree of dysfunction or instability?
Well, I suppose that when you've had, and the marriage did get quite lively towards the end, and then my mum took up with my stepdad Ro, who was in my life from the age of about 9. A very solid man, absolute grafter, worked his arse off, very similar to her, was brought up periodically in council care, but just had a strong value system and stuff. And my dad calmed down, the divorce sort of finally sobered him up.
Literally sobered him up.
Literally sobered him up. And then, so in their own way, they were both like, they were all through, my mum and dad in particular, but they all came with baggage, but equally they had good value systems, and they were always kind of just about fight, they were fighting the good fight all the time. So they were like, my dad was really kind of had a sober view of the world, ironically. My stepdad was a grafter. My mum was a real sort of diplomat. She was good at de-escalating. She's good at starting conflicts, but she also knew how to de-escalate it as well. And I think quite early on in life, I became aware that they'd all had difficult childhoods, and it sounds like being a bit smart for a teenager, but I did actually allow them that very early on.
So you had empathy for because it's unusual to have empathy for your parents. I think contempt for your parents, that's the stage my kids are at, but I'll tell them that empathy is another possibility they might like to explore.
Well, I just trust people. If I buy into people, I thought, when they said stuff, I was like, okay, yeah, I accept that. And particularly, sadly now they've both passed away, but one thing that does do is give you complete perspective over your parents, and it does help you, some of the odder decisions start to make more sense once they're both gone, because it's
also great when you're writing a book and everyone you're writing about's dead. That's an absolute gift, I would imagine. The
lawyers were delighted.
I bet they were.
Yeah, can I say this? I'm like, yeah, I've just hang on, what's that, Dad? Yeah.
But you had again, when I was sort of thinking about what to talk to you about today, and I wrote down that you'd had a bit of a tough last decade, which is a slight understatement, right? Because you lost your parents, both your biological parents, your stepdads, and your best friend, and you lost your little girl at 34 weeks pregnant. So that was all. So that's one hell, and that was all in the space of what, 5-6 years?
Yeah, around about that middle part of the last decade. It was an iceberg in life. Just hit it head on, and kept going. Kept working. But I think, and I've spoke about this a bit, but and it's dangerous to stereotype too much about the male and female reactions to grief. But my specific situation, it meant that it was strategically wise to bury some stuff for a while, particularly when you've got a wife who's been, had to do labour for a child that isn't there.
Because the attention does go to the woman in that situation, which is absolutely understandable. Yeah. But I guess it does always, that there is the other parent who's may not have gone through that biologically and physically, but you've still gone through that, and that's one hell of a body blow, right?
It can be, and what happens is you tend to become the spokesperson for the family. So, but you report on how the family's doing. She's doing fine. We're coming back, and people really principally care about the wife. And then at the point where they might start to think about you, that's normally 6 months afterwards. And if you're not grieving, 6 months is quite a long time. But if you are, or you're just starting, as I was, or not just even beginning to start, it doesn't seem like very long at all. And it sounds a bit of a wanky phrase, but it's all well and good. I think, push feelings down if you have to, and you've got an awkward phrase to use, but it might say man up and get through something. But just remember where you put the feelings, because that would be the difficulty. If you start suddenly open that chest and go, where the fuck were these feelings?
Well, that's the bit I always struggle with. That as someone who is very overly sort of, I think I've got a high EQ, and I try and think through life and analyze stuff. And whenever I have painful relationship breakups, I carry it around, and I look at the blokes I break up with, I'm like, well, he seems absolutely fine. He's fucking his, his best friend's sister. And then I've said to a couple of therapists, but surely it's better to be like him then, because he's not thinking about it and he's just gone off and lived his life, and I'm carrying all this. And then therapists will say, no, but you can have the rich texture of the good stuff, and you feel all of it in more sort of technicolor. But would you say would you say you are someone who sort of packages things away and tries to kind of deal with it in whether it's gender related or not, but deal with it in what maybe traditionally is more of a male way?
Yeah, I would say so in the first instance, but then I like feeling okay. I like to feel well slept, fresh, mentally alert, and once stuff that starts dragging on that, I will be relentless in my excavation of myself to find out what that is.
And how do you do that excavation of yourself then?
Well, once you've got composite grief of 5 or more people, you have to sit down and just stop and think, not meditate, but just like, who am I sad about? What am I sad about? Just almost talk like, some songwriters write songs by scatting, where you just kind of just happen across a feeling. It's always just that little sentence, isn't it? And most of it, for anyone grieving, is almost always, I miss them. That's almost always what it is. I wish that they'd been here. It's the most basic stuff imaginable.
Or I wish I'd said this or done that. And now it's too late.
Regrets, beating yourself up. I think from experience with my male friends, like the beating yourself up thing, and maybe it is more natural that men would think that, because we are more emotionally retentive during people's lives. We've said less to these people, we've demonstrated our love less to these people. So I think that, I've been lucky to have decent therapists and stuff like that. And
so you are a believer in therapy? I
had to be, because I just got to a point where the collective shit that happened had dragged me so far down. I just didn't have a choice, and your medication as well. When you move in sort of like creative circles, people often be very casual about medication. They just go, well, it's a very brave thing to do to take medication. I'm like, no, it wasn't brave, right? It was just what I had to do. I wish still that I didn't have to do it. I was always thinking, when's the first point I can reduce my dosage and get off of this? But it was just a case of, I've got a wife, and then I've got a kid. I've got to
keep functioning. I was always very judgmental about people taking any kind of medication or antidepressants until I had my first brush with depression, and then I realised, like you, I did it at my show. I think you came to it, Super Cally Fragile Lipstick, which, as you'll agree, was the best thing about that show. It was the title, but but I talked in that about depression and antidepressants, and that nobody's going, oh, do you know what? Today I'd like to go to my GP and see if I wouldn't mind a bit of an SSRI dose. You do it because that's what you have to do to keep doing it.
You do, But then I think that it can get very comfortable on them. I know that because I've done that. I remember at times I just decided, and I think anybody on antidepressants has decided to go, I'm just going to do this for life. And then you think that's signed off now. I don't have to worry about this.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I sort of worry that I'm not feeling life in all of its kind of richness. And also sometimes I think that it artificially improves your mood, right? So if you're grieving, that's fine that sometimes you have to push some of that away, but eventually there's something healthy about facing whatever it is that you feel. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some mental health conditions where it's not even a possibility for people to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm not being casual about that, but I think if your thing is trauma based, I just think personally, I like to have an idea in mind. I've been on medication several times now of like, right, is there a sort of exit route for this?
So it's been antidepressant type, SSRI type sort of medication.
Yeah, I don't understand too well, but it's the one that so there's one that makes you feel happy,
yeah,
and then one that takes whatever decent mood you got knocking about and props it up.
yeah. And have you tried all of those cocktails?
No. It's been the same one every time. It's worked pretty well for me.
When I think about who I think of you as, and what so there's a sort of your upbringing might have knocked any kind of vulnerability out of you. You might have learned to, like, I'm going to just do what's required. And your onstage persona is very much, you'd come on and you joke about, you think that, what's your line you say about being an electrician or something? What is it you say on stage?
Why is an electrician wandered on stage?
Yeah, why is an electrician wandered on the stage? And you sort of play up to the kind of like everyman working class kind of guy.
Yeah.
And is what I've seen of you. You don't talk much about that more vulnerable side, or something like grief or gender. Is that something that you see as quite separate?
I have in other shows.
Have you?
I mean, like I've been doing sort of these shows for a while, so it kind of changes the focus. So if there's kind of social issues or what people might call woke stuff that becomes more interesting to you for a while, but I think, yeah, there was a show not sort of 3 or 4 years ago I did that was a lot about grief and stuff like that. If anything, weirdly, the next show that I'm doing, there is some stuff some themes I want to revisit. One of them being about, the stages of grief, where they say shock, denial, anger, bargaining, etc. Whatever the fuck it is. But I definitely think
you're meant to get to acceptance at some point. I think that's quite an important part of that cycle, Geoff. Don't forget that.
Well, I went straight to acceptance, then worked back the other way. But I don't think the first stage is shock. I think it's admin. I was thinking about this the other day. Whenever someone dies, it's like, right, here, you know what you need? It's almost something weirdly British about burying your head in paperwork. Then the next stage is event management, because you've then thrown into organising a fucking party. So I hope that, in this way of being funny about things, you get information out about yourself that you think, and I am becoming conscious of this, is if that there are a certain kind of bloke that identifies with me, is dropping in things like depression, counselling, medication, so on, demystifying it just a little bit, because one of the problems with a certain kind of bloke is the way that mental health tends to get spoken about is really off-putting for working class men. It's always about, it's so brave, it's so well done, and it's very it makes you feel really uncomfortable. But if you can talk about it in a pragmatic way, like brain maintenance, effectively,
it's like keeping yourself, it's like going to the gym for your brain, really, isn't it? It's funny because I did, I've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast. People think I've got a slice of the business, but when I did the Hoffman process 18 months ago, I went in there thinking it'll all be women my kind of age. I'll probably be at the younger end. There'll be a lot of floral print, suede, boots and that sort of. And I went in and it was, I was one of the oldest people in there, and it was mostly blokes, and lots of them weren't posh blokes, and it totally threw me.
There are also these men's groups as well that meet up where men tend to fall out of touch with their friends more than women as their lives go on. So there are these strange men's groups that meet up. It
sounds a bit like a Partridge sketch. There are these men's groups.
No, there are. I attended for a taster for a documentary.
So what are they doing in the men's groups?
So they meet up. There was one where it was a much smaller group with a guy who's very good called the Man Whisperer, and he puts like a pretend fire in the middle, and he just goes around, and you have to give like a little itinerary of what you are, but then you also have to say when you last ejaculated was. And I'm so immature. It's just funny. It's just funny, and so this
doesn't happen at the Women's Institute. When did you last come? They don't ask that.
I know, it was really, but then it was a good question actually. Like, it was a good question because I think there's a point in middle age.
It's a room full of blokes, isn't it? Always like 20 minutes ago. I suppose it depends on the age.
Yeah. I mean, like, you're right. I'd stop every impetus in me to say something stupid or schoolboyish or immature. Well, I'll go to I'll let you know. You know what I mean? And they're all looking at you like, speak soon. And then there was a bigger group, which was about like getting in touch with your masculine energy, guys, and stuff. And there was one bit of that where everyone was walking in circles around the room, and some of the blokes had their t-shirts off and were like, like primal screaming, all that kind of shit. And then one guy, I'll never forget this. There was a kind of iron girder that went overhead, and just to express his masculinity even further, he jumped up and did the pull up on it as he was going, and he was impressive. Like, I thought when he jumped up, he would stack it, but I just thought, okay, I've reached my limit. But what the reason that group was a success, because evidently there's loads of blokes that they don't feel that there's a conduit for their masculinity, which is something that they feel, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. So they've had to end up meeting up in community centres on a Tuesday night, which is kind of
and
sad.
jacking off on iron girders. It sounds like, that's a good night.
You've crossed
out.
the groups there. You have crossed the groups, but maybe that's the group that people would pay more for.
I think the Man Whisperer, I might use that as my byline on Hinge.
He's great. No, he's worth checking out. If you're interested in all this as a bloke, Kenny Marmarella de Cruz is his real name.
Really? What great names. I'll put this in I'll have a look and I'll put it in the show notes.
Get Kenny on. He's well worth speaking to, yeah.
Is he? Okay. I'll tell him you said so.
Namaste, motherfucker.
What would you pick as your namaste motherfucking life-changing moment?
I met Russ Abbott when I was 9. But now it sounds like I'm just saying this to be funny, but I did meet him when I was 9. I was a big fan. And my mum.
How did you meet him?
So this is the mum, the Tony Soprano, basically bullied the office at Surprise. Remember the Still a Black program?
Of course I do.
So she got in touch with them. They were between productions, so there was only a skeleton staff. She basically made one poor woman's life hell. It was like, my son needs to meet Russ Abbott. She's just obsessed. He's going to meet Russ Abbott. And Russ Abbott was on stage in the West End at the time doing Me and My Girl. And,
of course he was.
And we went up to meet him, and I went in there. I told him some surreal joke, and it didn't make any sense. And he was kind of like, "Hey, groove it," like probably said to his agent, "These fucking surrealists coming through," this alternative scene. But what it did do was it broke down. I have had a lifelong thing with big, important, and famous people that I'm not that phased, and my mum did a couple of things like that early in life. She harangued Biddy Baxter at Blue Peter once because me and my sister.
That's bold, because Biddy Baxter was nobody crossed Biddy Baxter.
Well, no, and we raised like £7.20 like a car boot sale, something really.
That's
modest
not even
sum.
the cost of a Blue Peter badge.
Not even the cost of a Blue Peter badge. But my mum got us a meeting with Biddy Baxter
for raising £7.20. That's not even a pouch of food for Shep the dog. You did well there.
We wasted her time, actually. I think.
Did you?
She could have made more charity money by doing other things. We actually probably harmed some kids.
You did. So meeting Russ Abbott was your namaste motherfucking moment. It does help not having your skirt blown up by fame, I think, in our business. I think coming from the other side of the camera, having worked with so many people behind the scenes, it just sort of doesn't matter. You just don't think of it in that way. Now I have professional jealousy, but I still don't have a kind of, I can't talk to you because you're famous.
Well, you'd be more, I can't talk to you in a room with no other females present.
That's true. Yeah. Let's have a Me Too joke in at the end of my my feminist podcast, Geoff. Thank you for that.
No, I was trying to be like, yay, sisters, right?
Oh yeah, you were. Trouble is, it's a fine line, Geoff, isn't it? It's a fight for all of us.
This is one of the problems. When you sound like me, that sounded like that's one thing.
I'm going to just put that out as a clip tonight on Twitter, so let the people vote.
Well, it'd be great for my audience. They'll be like, yeah, you fucking. But that's what I sometimes come a cropper, and you're honest enough to say what you thought about that. But when you sometimes do TV stuff, but people can literally think you're saying the opposite thing.
Well, it's all in the edit as well, isn't it? I mean, I know they say, reality TV contestants. I used to work on a lot of those shows behind the scenes, and they'd always come out going, "It was a bad edit. You edited me to look like that," and you're thinking, "No, you did that. We made you look more interesting, but you did all that." But people can sew it. That's the bit when I was saying to you about doing question time. I would hate to do question time because I always think there's that one thing you say that absolutely isn't how you meant it, and then that's the bit they show without the context.
Oh, always. Yeah.
And then you're like, "Oh, great! I'm the dickhead that said that thing that I don't even believe."
Well, one thing that happens in question time is that the gig itself is quite short and sweet. You chat a bit. There's about 100 to 150 people in the room. Everyone's quite cordial. Even the weird moments seem to come and go quite quickly. But it has this life online that's so far beyond that. So in the beginning of 2019, I think I was on it was Brexit was very tense and febrile, and I said something about Donald Tusk. And I said, Andrew Marr had said, why won't any of these EU top brass appear on political debate shows in the UK? They say they represent us. Why won't they come on? And I kind of developed the theme, but then I'd had a lot of medication because I was ill. And then I said, yeah, well, at the end of the day, he hasn't got the balls, has he? And then you can imagine.
It's not a question time thing to say, Geoff. That was a rookie error.
That was a rookie. Well, that was my third time on, so it wasn't a rookie. It was an idiot error.
Yeah. But
even that came and went, and then it went out, and then question time, of course, replayed that. And then you just got like the absolute dregs of both sides of the argument. So you got some people like going, yeah, fuck Tusk, like, yeah. But also all these real Romani middle-class dudes drinking Merlot late at night. just
chewing on a brioche like they do.
Yeah, just thinking that you are the real reason that they're angry about life. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, sometimes it can be merited. I mean, I shouldn't have said that.
You should not have put your balls out. And 2 years later, I hope they've receded, Geoff, and that particular moment of shame has gone. What is your favourite joke?
My favourite joke it's quite a long one, but there's a group of pigeons from Trafalgar Square, right? This is a very old joke and a weird joke. They go up to Buckingham Palace and they see the Buckingham Palace pigeons and they go, oh, hello. He goes, it's nice to meet you. He goes, you don't normally meet other groups of pigeons. You know, he goes, yeah, we heard a lot of the tourists chat about Buckingham Palace, so we thought we'd come up and have a look. And I said, well, I tell you what, Trafalgar Square, normally at midnight, people leave a bit of bread and a bit of water. We have a bit of a do, so why don't you come down and say hello? You go, well, yeah, once we've finished up here, then we'll come down at midnight, you say. Midnight. So, all right, see you then. So the Trafalgar Square pigeons go back. And it gets to midnight, they're all waiting. I thought you said these Buckingham Palace pigeons were coming. They'll definitely be here. They're definitely coming. midnight, 1 o'clock. They're just about to pack up. And then in the distance there, you see this group of Buckingham Palace pigeons just waddling their way through. And I said, what happened to you lot? I said, well, you know, it's a nice evening. We thought we'd walk. It's so stupid. Now, the punchline, you can take or leave. For me, just the exchange.
It's all in the setup.
Yeah, I mean, even I embroidered, you don't meet many other groups of pigeons. You can really attach to that.
I think, is that one of your jokes, Geoff?
That's an old mainstream joke.
Is it? One of the ones that no one knows who to claim?
Well, that was one of the ones that guys were telling Dickie Bows in the 80s, and then everyone concluded that every single one of those guys was racist and misogynistic, when actually it was a few of them, and most of them were actually really silly, silly jokes and had puppets and all, and sung songs. Oh, I know a song that will get on your nerves, and suddenly the trouncing victory of the alternative scene then decided that every single comic from that era was a bigot.
Yeah, that's true. Although U-Tree didn't help the cause of a few people from that era, although I appreciate that was less in comedy than in mainstream kind of entertainment. But we won't get into U-Tree at the end of
look, I did a Me Too. You've done a U-Tree. I think we're even now.
We've saved it all to the end. I'll give you the third mention of your book, Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me. Right, that's the last book reference you're getting. So the very last thing I always ask everybody on Namaste Motherfuckers, Geoff, is if there was one bit of life advice you could give to anyone listening, what would it be?
Remember your passport number and as many other of your key life numbers as you can, just because you'll feel really smug when you have to fill out stuff and everyone's fucking about trying to get stuff out. Sort code, account number, passport number, driver's license number, if you can. You'll just feel so happy every single time that you have to do that. Do you know that bit at the end of a flight where you have to fill out a landing card? It's weirdly stressful, isn't it? You're paying, oh God, what was the flight number? All this stuff. First up, if you know you're going somewhere else, just put the flight number in notes on your phone as you sit down. You're done. Okay. Then you already know your passport number. It can really screw up the end of a nice long haul flight, that.
Geoff,
so that's it. That's the
big answers to the big questions.
Well, the truth is, politics, comedy, life, I'm not really certain about many things. So if I'm going to give a 100% recommendation, that I'm certain that that's a good idea.
And I'm certain that it's been a very, very long lockdown for your poor wife. But, you know, the lights at the end of the tunnel now. Thanks for joining me.
She's always drunk at the end of the flight. This is why I had to learn to do it in the first place. There's
a reason she's drunk at the end of a long-haul flight with you, Geoff. I'm just saying. But, you know, let's not get into that.
Namaste, motherfuckers.
That was my comedy all-round good egg Geoff Norcott, and you can find links to his book and all his other good stuff in the show notes, as well as some information for anyone needing support with their mental health. Now, every episode I pick a thing inspired by my guest, as you know, that I am going to try. The events of recent years, not least the vote to leave, highlighted the fact that I was one of many who was only seeking out people and news sources with opinions like my own. This doesn't support nuanced thinking, and it keeps us depressed, and it keeps us divided. In an attempt to counter that, I am going to get stuck into Matt Ford's Political Party podcast, which, for anyone who doesn't know it, he interviews politicians across all parties in a quite relaxed and not always very political way. And I'm going to start, so help me God, with his episode with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Talk about aversion therapy. Sorry, no more bad mouthing of the other side. I am going to give that an open-minded listen. And by the way, did I mention Matt is my guest on this podcast in just a couple of weeks? So stay tuned for that, motherfuckers. Namaste, Motherfuckers was written and presented by me, Cally Beaton, with music by Jake Yap and produced by Mike Hansen for Pod People Productions. If you've liked today's show, please subscribe now on your favourite podcast app and also rate and review the show. We'll be back in your feed next Monday when I'll be talking to author, political activist, journalist and founding leader of the Women's Equality Party, Sophie Walker.
Yeah, I struggled with that. I struggled with being public. I struggled with understanding to what extent I was public.
I'm Cally Beaton. Until next time, motherfuckers.
Namaste, motherfuckers.